The story begins in the quiet of Montana, far away from the cameras and lights that have long followed the Lamb family. The sun had just started to rise, painting the skies in soft streaks of gold and pink. Jonathan and Suzy were tucked into the rhythm of a peaceful morning. They had stepped away from so much noise in recent years, stepped away from the endless headlines, the constant pull of ministry schedules, and the weight of family expectations. Montana had become a place of calm for them, a refuge where the mountain air felt clean and where they could wake up without the world staring over their shoulders. That morning seemed no different. The kettle hummed softly on the stove, the smell of coffee already filling the house. Suzy picked up her phone, expecting nothing more than the usual string of texts or updates. But what she saw on the screen stopped her in her tracks. A photo. Just a simple photo from her friend, Rose Howard. Yet what it carried was more than pixels. It carried love, prayer, and a connection across thousands of miles. The picture was of the Western Wall in Jerusalem. Some call it the Wailing Wall, some the Kotel. For centuries, people have gone there with prayers scrawled on scraps of paper, tucked into the cracks between the ancient stones. Kings, presidents, soldiers, pilgrims, mothers, children, all leaving behind pieces of themselves in the hope that their prayers would rise to heaven from that sacred place. And now Jonathan and Suzy's names were there too. Rose had written them out in her own handwriting, Jonathan on one slip, Suzy on another. She had folded the slips carefully, reverently, and pressed them into the wall with her fingertips. The photo showed those folded notes nestled deep in the crevices of stone polished by time and tears. Alongside the notes were hundreds of others, creating a mosaic of faith, each one carrying a story, a longing, a plea. Somewhere in that crowd of papers, Jonathan and Suzy's names rested, carried into history, carried into prayer. When Suzy saw it, her breath caught. Tears welled in her eyes almost instantly. She could feel the weight of it. This wasn't just a gesture, it was spiritual, intimate, powerful. She handed the phone to Jonathan, and for a moment they both sat in silence. He stared at the photo, his hand tightening around the coffee mug, his eyes softening. He wasn't a man who often wore his emotions for the world to see, but in that moment, his heart was wide open. It was as if God had reached across the ocean, across time zones, across the noise of life to remind them, you are seen, you are loved, you are not forgotten. For Jonathan it struck even deeper. He had grown up under the shadow of a massive ministry, carrying the weight of expectations few people could imagine. Every decision was scrutinized. Every word carried echoes of his father's legacy. And in recent years he had wrestled with his role in that legacy, wondering where he truly fit in, wondering what God was asking of him now. And then, this. A note tucked into the wall, his name whispered in prayer in the holiest city on earth. It felt like God's way of saying, you still matter. I still have my eye on you. Suzy, moved beyond words, couldn't keep it to herself. She opened her heart to the world in the way she often did, by sharing. On her social media, she posted the photo with her own words. Woke up on a beautiful Montana morning to a pic from our sis Rose in Israel at the Wailing Wall. She put our names in and prayed for us. Love her so much. My heart is so happy I had to share it. It wasn't just a post. It was a testimony. It was a snapshot of faith and friendship that stirred something in people. As soon as she hit share, comments began to pour in. So beautiful, one follower wrote. Crying with you this morning, said another. Others chimed in. God is with you, Jonathan and Suzy. What a blessing to be prayed for in Jerusalem. This touched my heart so deeply. It was as if the photo had created ripples, reaching into living rooms, churches, and hearts around the world. Jonathan and Suzy sat together in their Montana home, reading the responses, feeling the waves of love wash over them. The messages weren't just for them, they were for every person who had ever wondered if God still heard, if prayer still mattered, if love could travel across oceans. In that moment the answer was yes. Yes, prayers are powerful. Yes, love crosses borders. Yes, God still speaks through the smallest gestures. The timing of it all felt uncanny. Joni Lamb and her new husband, Doug Weiss, were in Israel at the very same moment. Their trip was public, filled with official meetings, including time with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his wife, Sarah. The spotlight was on them. The news updates, the photos, the announcements, all eyes were fixed on the couple representing Daystar on foreign soil. Yet while those headlines captured the world's attention, something quieter and far more intimate was happening. Hidden from cameras, away from microphones, a single act of friendship was unfolding. A message not to the crowds but to two hearts in Montana. And perhaps that contrast was the real miracle. Ministry doesn't always happen in front of the masses. Sometimes it's a note tucked into a stone. Sometimes it's a photo shared at dawn. Sometimes it's a reminder that God moves just as powerfully in the quiet places as in the global stage. That morning, Jonathan and Suzy prayed together. They prayed for Rose, for her trip, for the prayers she carried to the wall. They prayed for strength, for guidance, for the courage to keep walking in faith even when their path felt uncertain. They prayed for their family, for Joni, for their siblings, for the ministry their father built, for clarity and peace in the storms that often surrounded them. And in those whispered prayers, they felt a thread connect them, not just to Rose and Israel but to generations of believers who had done the same in that sacred place. As the day moved on, the photo remained on the table, glowing on Suzy's phone screen. Every time they looked at it, they felt it again, that sense of being carried, of being remembered, of being part of something so much larger than themselves. And though the world might never know the full depth of what it meant to them, Jonathan and Suzy knew. They would never forget that morning. It was a chapter in their story that would stay with them forever. The day they received a message from Israel that wasn't just ink on paper, it was love pressed into stone, prayers whispered into eternity. While Jonathan and Suzy were quietly moved in Montana, thousands of miles away, Joni Lamb and Doug Weiss were walking the bustling streets of Jerusalem. Their trip had been carefully announced by Daystar: posts, photos, press releases. It was more than a vacation. It was painted as a spiritual and political mission. Meetings with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his wife Sarah gave the visit a sense of weight. Cameras flashed as Joni and Doug stood in front of historic sites, smiling, shaking hands, speaking of the sacred bond between Israel and the Christian faith. But behind the bright lights, there was another story unfolding, one that few people noticed. The same city that carried Joni and Doug into boardrooms and headlines was also carrying a message to Jonathan and Suzy, one they hadn't expected, one they hadn't even asked for. When Rose pressed those slips of paper into the cracks of the Western Wall, she wasn't thinking of politics, power, or television networks. She was thinking of friendship, of love, of the kind of faith that carries people when the world feels too heavy. Her act was quiet, almost invisible. Yet somehow, it became louder than all the announcements, louder than all the staged photos. Jonathan and Suzy kept reflecting on that contrast. Joni and Doug were in Israel physically, yet it was Jonathan and Suzy who received the most personal connection from that sacred land. It was almost ironic, Joni standing before crowds, shaking hands with leaders, yet the prayer that truly reached home was whispered over the names of the son and daughter-in-law she left behind in Montana. For Jonathan, the moment touched wounds he rarely spoke about. He had grown up as Marcus and Joni's son. His entire life had been tied to Daystar's mission, its successes and its storms. From childhood, he was placed in the public eye, expected to carry the mantle of ministry. And though he had tried, the pressure sometimes felt suffocating. With Marcus's sudden passing, those expectations doubled. The ministry world watched him, waiting for him to become a mirror of his father. But Jonathan was not his father. He was himself, quieter, gentler, more reserved. He carried a different heart. Suzy knew this well. She saw the way he wrestled at night, the way his thoughts lingered on whether he could ever truly belong in a world that demanded so much. She had told him again and again, "Jonathan, you don't have to prove yourself to anyone. God sees you." And now, as they both looked at that photo from Rose, it felt like God himself was saying it again, only louder. For Suzy, the moment was healing too. She had often felt the sting of whispers, the critical eyes that watched her every move because of who she married. She wasn't born into Daystar. She had stepped into it through Jonathan, carrying the weight of being judged, compared, misunderstood. She had smiled through it, loved through it, and stayed by Jonathan's side even when storms grew fierce. But deep down, there were moments she felt invisible, like her prayers were lost in the noise. And yet here was Rose, across the sea, writing her name on paper and pressing it into the cracks of a wall that had carried centuries of tears. To Suzy, that meant everything. It was as if God leaned down and whispered, "I see you too. I know your name. I know your heart." The irony was impossible to ignore. Joni and Doug traveled to Israel to strengthen ties with leaders and make headlines, yet Jonathan and Suzy were the ones who experienced the true heartbeat of Israel that week. It wasn't the staged photos. It wasn't the political speeches. It was the prayer, the intimacy, the unseen gesture of a friend who believed their names mattered enough to place them before God in the holiest place she could find. And perhaps that was the message God was weaving together. Ministry isn't always about stages or cameras. Sometimes the truest ministry happens quietly, in the hidden places with no spotlight. That night in Montana, Jonathan and Suzy sat outside on their porch, the mountains silhouetted against the fading light. The photo from Rose still rested on Suzy's phone, but now it had become more than a picture. It had become a reminder. Jonathan stared into the horizon, thinking about the many years his family had tied themselves to Israel. The tours, the conferences, the broadcast. But never had Israel felt this close, this personal, this piercing. He turned to Suzy and said softly, "Do you think this means something more?" Suzy smiled, her eyes glistening. "It already does. God doesn't waste moments like this. Maybe He's reminding us that He hasn't forgotten us. Maybe He's telling us that no matter what happens, here or there, He has our names in His hands." They prayed again, not out of ritual but out of raw emotion. They prayed for Joni and Doug in Israel, asking God to give them wisdom and clarity. They prayed for Rose, whose simple gesture had touched them so deeply. They prayed for themselves, for courage to keep walking faithfully even when they didn't know where the road would lead. As they prayed, there was no doubt in their hearts. This wasn't coincidence. This was a message from God, delivered in the most unexpected way. It was a reminder that their story wasn't over. That even when the spotlight shifted elsewhere, heaven was still writing chapters for them. Chapters that mattered. And though no cameras captured it, no headlines reported it, the real story of that week in Israel wasn't just Joni and Doug's meetings with political leaders. It was this: Jonathan and Suzy far away in Montana, holding onto a photo of a prayer tucked into ancient stones, feeling the arms of God wrap around them through a message they didn't expect but desperately needed.